All right, good morning.
Morning.
We are, well, for the sake of the recording, this is Fundamentals of Biblical Counseling, Session 3 on Becoming a Good Listener. Okay, now that we have that done and said. We're going to do this. We're going to just wrap up some unfinished things from the previous session. Then we're going to dive into being a good listener. In your notes, in the back, is there like a chart that with a bunch of questions about being a good listener?
It says characteristics.
Yes. Okay. Let me just say this from the onset. When the first interaction paper is due, here's an alternative that you can do if you'd like to do this. You can do that survey on each other. So, you have your friend evaluate how good of a listener you are, and then flip it and do the same thing, and then in lieu of the interaction paper, just write a little summary of what you learned, and that might be a very productive, helpful exercise for the first interaction paper. All right. So that's just an alternative if you'd like to do that. Or if you just want to do that for fun, have somebody fill out that page to see what your listening skills are like. I just wanted to say that from the onset. So we're going to take a moment here, though, and catch up on Session 3. If you'll remember, we summarized the whole process of biblical counseling. Even though we covered the 8 elements, if we could just remember the 3, right? Inventory, observation, right? Or diagnostics, that's the interpretation, and then the instruction or the application. And we get this idea from how we exposit the scriptures. We do use the same method, basically. And so since we're not only exegeting Scripture, we're also exegeting the counselee and the culture that they live in. This is a good paradigm to keep in the back of our minds. And again, as you're counseling somebody, you can remember that there's sort of a sequential order to this, no doubt. You can't give advice before you understand what's going on, and you can't understand what's going on until you gather some data, gather some information, gather some understanding. So this process is sequential, but you sometimes go back to it. I certainly up front in the early sessions when you're meeting with somebody more formally, there's a lot of data gathering at the beginning. It doesn't mean you don't offer some hope or something, toward the end or somewhere in the conversation. But a lot of it is data gathering, just so that you understand what's going on. And I have found that even the diagnostics don't take place until at least the second session. And depending on the nature of the problem, some problems are very complex. But so there is a sequential order to this, but sometimes you have to revisit that. Now, inventory, we said we're acquiring information in order to gain a better understanding into what's going on in the person's life. All right, so the goal of inventory is understanding. Do I understand the nature of the problem, the nature of the struggle, the nature of their pain, their suffering, whatever it might be? Do I understand what's going on? And in order to do that, we said we ask questions. One of the important skills of being a good counselor is knowing how to ask questions. Not so much answer, that comes later, but initially to be able to have the skill of asking good questions. And we said there's 2 kinds of questions. The extensive question. What's the extensive questions? What are those? What's our goal in asking extensive questions? Yep, Rebecca.
You want to ask them in a way that narrows down starts to, you ask them questions that start the process in narrowing down the information.
All right. Yep. Yep. You need a 10,000-foot view, right? And then you eventually want to move toward the intensive questions, the narrow end of the neck of the funnel for our illustration. But yes, we need to find the extensive questions tell us about their world and the setting of whatever the problem or the issue is for them. Because their problems take place in real life. So what is their life like? If they're dealing with depression, if they're dealing with thought life issues, all of that, what's their life like? If we're dealing, we said if they're dealing with something that they have either been diagnosed or they've put a label on it, we want to understand what that means. What that means to them, what that means in their life. I said something that's very postmodern, what it means to them. I do need to find out what it means to them, because if I don't, we're not gonna communicate on the same level. We're gonna have an understanding of two different words. Even though I believe there's only one meaning, one intended meaning, I can't assume that we both have that same understanding. So that's why I need to understand their world too. You may not know much about ADHD. You may not know much about general anxiety disorder. You may not know some of the terms that may come up in your conversation. That's okay. But what you can do, and this is what compassion does, you work to understand what that means in the context of their life. One question I ask oftentimes is, so tell me how that affects your day. What's your day like? If we're in a BI context, how does this impact class? How does this impact your concentration? Does this keep you up at night? See, what I'm trying to understand now is how this is impacting their life. Because I want to make a connection, and the best way I can make a connection is when we begin to understand. In fact, by the way, that's what connects the counselor to the counselee. Again, using the doctor illustration. When you go to the doctor and you explain their problem and they're able to repeat it back to you, you're like, she knows what's going on. That brings connection. That brings confidence. When I discovered I had three blocks in my heart about 10 years ago, my doctor, she was great. She asked good questions, and even by the questions she was asking, I had confidence she was understanding what was going on. And that's the goal. That's the goal. So that's what we're trying to do. And then the intensive questions, we'll use the preach for the extensive questions that to get the 10,000-foot view. And then we're talking about the intensive questions. Those are the more specific to the nature and impact of the issues that one is struggling with, as we've been talking about. And I gave you some examples of perhaps somebody who is dealing with anxiety in their life. Again, these are some questions that help you to begin to understand what's going on. And then something else. Another form of data gathering is using journals. But journals for a very specific purpose. Journals are good. And some people really communicate well writing on a journal. Others, it's like I can't write. They don't. But so that's kind of an individual preference for people, an individual learning style for people. But when I'm talking about a journal, this is what I'm talking about. And a journal is something you have them do in between sessions. So if they're struggling with something and you're still trying to understand what it is, what this struggle looks like in their life, and maybe they're having a hard time even communicating. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes these struggles have been so much a part of their life for such a long time, it's hard to communicate. So one of the things you want to do is give them an opportunity just to kind of think through something. Let's say they're working through something like anxiety or something, and you discover that some of it is episodic. In other words, there's episodes. Not necessarily full-blown panic attack, but close. Or it might be panic attacks. So you want to understand what's going on in something like that. So there's 4 main areas to have them journal. So let's say they have an episode of some sort. And again, to get the full picture of their world and what they're dealing with, let's say right afterwards, because in the middle of it, they may not, most of the time, they're not going to be able to think clearly like this, is find out they jot down what was going on in their life that day. What were some of the main circumstances going on? What were some of the main issues? Some people talk about panic attacks in the context of triggers. Okay? So what were some triggers that may have been part of their life at that point? How did they react? For example, a trigger might be a person. Maybe a family member that they hadn't seen in a while, and they get a text from them or email or something, and it just sets them off. So how did you react? And they might have said, "Man, I just panicked." Well, what was that like? Please describe when you panicked. What did you do? I just ran to the bathroom and threw up. Okay, or a host of different things. How did you process that? How were you processing that? Could you remember what you were thinking about, what you were worrying about, what you were afraid that might happen? How were you processing this? When you saw that text, do you remember some of the things you started thinking about? Because oftentimes we don't realize this because this is so strong. People don't even start doing a dance up here. People don't even realize that their mind is processing. It is, because the mind is always processing. But this is so strong, it's hard to realize this. And sometimes in the calmer moment, it's very helpful to talk about how they remember regarding the things they were thinking about, how they were processing, what were the concepts running in their mind. Is that making sense so far? So jotting this down for them during the week, because they may not remember it, by the time they meet with you again. And then, this is kind of zeroing in more on the heart issues. And again, this is a hard thing, but it's getting them to start to think about this. At this level, the desires or the needs, expectations, or the things that they wanted in that moment. What are we talking about? For example, expectation. Getting that text out of the middle of nowhere, they weren't expecting that. So they weren't prepared for that. Because all of that just brought up stuff just like that. And that's very helpful. Because let's say things are the way I just described, part of the counsel to help them is to prepare them for the unexpected. But what are the unexpected things in their life? What were the things what were the perceived needs that they had? That maybe that they felt that they couldn't get. All right. Now, we're not going to evaluate the moral aspect of this at this point yet. We just need the data. We just need the data. So understand that. It's not, there it is, right there. That's not our point. What we're looking for eventually in all of our data gathering is themes. Themes and how they process life, how they deal with life. Or some of the kinds of patterns of the circumstances they face and how we can perhaps help them process those circumstances. Now, obviously, this is all assuming everything is, kind of at a spiritual, emotional level. If there's something physical going on, obviously they need the care of a physician and whatnot. All right, but this can be very helpful, and you can put if you're dealing with a guy, for example, who's dealing with pornography on the internet, same thing. Okay, same kind of pattern here. All right, and basically you can have him work through this, or have her work through this by during the week. How many times have they been tempted? How many times did they give in to the temptation? And even both the good outcome and even the failure or the bad outcome. Have them journal it. So what were the circumstances going on in your life? Now it's interesting because sometimes what happens is, the circumstances were just normal. Sometimes the circumstances are, sometimes people go to porn as a way of escape. And by the way, sometimes they do that so often they don't even realize they're doing that for a way of escape. So what are the circumstances? There might be some things that they're running away from, or, quite frankly, the desire is just so strong. Or what set it off? For people who are struggling with something like that, something sets it off. Just like that. A thought or something they see. How did you react? And what I'm talking about here is when the thought comes to your mind, what do you do with it? Do you make every thought captive to the obedience of Christ? Or do you let that thought continue? What were you thinking about? Sometimes somebody will start making plans very early because they don't have the opportunity, they're going to make plans. So the thinking wasn't just a thought, it actually, okay, how can I sin? And then, obviously, the desire aspect, again, the acting out aspect of pornography is really this. That's the behavior is not the cause. There's something deeper going on. What is it that they get from that? And that's what we want to work through. Now, I just opened a can of worms with that whole example, but there's a lot to both of those issues. But I'm just giving you an example of how to help them process that during the week. Now, a guy or a gal can handle that in the right way. The circumstances, the thoughts came to their mind. How did you react? I made every thought captive. Well, how did you do that? See, because this then demonstrates the right way to perhaps to handle it. Instead of planning how I was going to fulfill my fleshly passion, I started thinking about something else. I pulled up some scripture memory. I called my accountability partner. I just opened up my Bible and started reading. I went for a run. Whatever. Instead of planning to sin, he he put on Christ and put off every opportunity for the flesh. He ran away from it. So that's what we're trying to do with the journal. So it's a very specific journal. I mean, there's other things people journal. They're just going to journal maybe some thoughts that come to their mind and write those down. And that's great. But when I say journal, this is what I mean by journaling as a form of data gathering. All right. And any questions on that? All right. All right, so let's talk about being a good listener. This is an interesting diagram here. A student sent this to me a few years back. The Chinese character for listening. I don't know, is anybody linguistic? Anybody love linguistics? Chinese language, the Mandarin language, they're very interesting in the way they form words and characters. Characters are words and words are characters. It's not like the letter A. But the word for listen, all the different aspects, ears, eyes, mind, heart, focus. And that's a really good way to understand good listening. So, of course, a flagship verse for good biblical counseling is in the book of James, right? 1:19. Know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. I've always been intrigued by the phrase quick to listen. And I've always wondered what that meant until I got into counseling and realized how anxious I was to want to say something and how hard it was just to be quiet and listen. So the idea of being quick to listen means listening is not just passive, it's active. Because you can be there and you can be going, and your mind can be in Bermuda. That's for Bernie. Your mind could be far away and not there. And that's the idea of being quick to listen. And that's a good intro to this section in our study here. Now, let me ask you this. Are you a good listener? Are you a good listener? Yeah. Now let me ask you this. What would your best friend or roommate or family member say about your listening skills? One of the most common expressions in marriage counseling is this statement. He doesn't listen. And it's usually him. It's usually not her. It's usually the husband, not the wife. That's not always true, but he doesn't listen. That's a bad reputation to have. But what would people close to you say about your listening skills? Would they say you're a bad listener? So that's why I suggested perhaps as an alternative to your interaction paper to have somebody evaluate your listening skills. All right. Well, what makes a poor listener? Without looking at the notes, what are some poor what makes a poor listener?
Someone who doesn't make eye contact.
What?
I would say someone who doesn't make eye contact.
Okay.
Someone who makes assumptions about all the
Okay, good.
When someone makes it more about them than the other person.
Uh-huh. We're having a, yeah.
It's a big one.
Yeah, that is a big one.
And you can tell they're in a different world.
Yep.
When you don't care.
How? Yeah, that's good. How is that demonstrated, you think?
I don't know, taking in the information and really like breaking it down so you understand, so you can communicate better with the person. Because I can listen to, let's say, Kiko rambling about his day, and I could not care, and then he'd be like, "Oh, like, what do you think I could do better?" And I'd be like, "Bro, like, just try." And that'd be the worst answer, but if I listened to him and I understood what he was saying, and I just gave a comment that just like thought out and shows that I listen, would be a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah, we ought to do a little video, you know, kind of like a fun video, and include that in the class. You guys, that would be great, because that happens all the time, sadly. That happens all the time. And I'd be the first to admit sometimes that's me. So that's good. All right. So those are some things. I talk about three in our notes here. Three main areas, and I think a lot of them fit in one of these three, and you might be able to add some more to this, but one of the things is just zoning out. We were talking a little bit about that, or being easily distracted. You know, in the information age in which we live, we have so much information coming at us. There's so many different means, and it's right at our fingertips. But it's easy to zone out and get distracted. Think about your listening abilities even during class. Not this class, of course, but other classes. Think about it this way. If it's interesting, we're listening. I mean, that happens in class, you know, especially if there's an interesting illustration during a boring topic. But if we're not interested, it's harder, right? The discipline of listening is harder. And that's true in counseling. That's true in counseling too. How much do you zone out, especially when you're bored with what's being said? Now, sometimes it's another thing. You're tired. That's point number 3 there. But zoning out or being easily distracted makes for bad listening skills. And I hate when I forget to turn my ringer off on my phone. And I've done that. And then the thing goes off. And everybody goes, you know, and my reaction is, I apologize. I apologize because I should have turned it off. And that disrupts the conversation. But imagine if I would have answered the phone or started texting. So we and that for us maybe is like common sense, but that's not always the case. Impatient people make for bad listeners as well. That comes out when we interrupt, or we're getting impatient because they really like to talk. And everything they say, you know, they could have said it in 5 words and they decided to say it in 500. And it's easy just to get impatient. Now, sometimes, honestly, we have to direct that. We do have to direct some of that. But, you know, but we can't get impatient. Or we interrupt them and we cut them off. Or we answer the rest of their sentence. The other one is tiredness. That's another hindrance to listening. And sometimes you can't help that. But I think whatever it takes, within reason to stay awake, little or no sleep means you are already exhausted when you begin the conversation. So that's going to be a difficult challenge. But it does, whether it's your fault or not, it does impact communication. Consider the biblical picture of a bad listener, the proverbial fool. Notice some of the language here. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. That's what you're saying. It's all about me, not about understanding the other person. There's the goal we talk about of data gathering, of listening. If one gives an answer before he hears it, it's folly and shame. And that's why we want to be careful before we give advice. It's one thing to give hope. It's another thing to give advice before we understand. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There's more hope for a fool than for him. Whew. Okay, so now you're saying, well, I don't want to counsel now. These are qualifications of a counselor. I mean, this is just good communication, period. If we would apply these three principles in our relationships, imagine how our relationships would grow. All right. The biblical picture of the fool is the one who doesn't listen and understand, but speaks too quickly. He's impulsive. She answers before she actually hears. They don't take the time to hear and then speak. Because of this impulsive speech, it's deemed foolish. And really, this is an area we just need to be continually growing in. And if not, if not, then let's acknowledge it, let's confess it, and let's work on how do we repent? How do we change that? Don't let it wipe you out. Don't let it discourage you. Don't let it disqualify you. Sometimes biblical counseling reveals where we need to grow as well. So, what makes an active, good, excellent listener? Actively listening and incarnational listening. What we're doing here is we're contrasting the proverbial fool with the advice we get from the Apostle James. Again, James's counsel to us is to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. So what does that mean? Well, that means we're active, we're not passive. James' encouragement is to be quick to hear and slow to speak. Wisdom and love are displayed in quickly hearing and not speaking. And that's why I take notes. Notes helps me to listen, because I have to write down what they're saying. Interacting. If I do interrupt somebody, and sometimes I do, but it's strategic, and they don't seem to mind when I'm asking, I'm sorry, could you say that again? Or, I'm sorry, I'm not following your train of thought. Help me to understand something here. That's active listening. If they're talking and you're not understanding what they're saying and you let the conversation go, that's not active listening. Active listening doesn't mean you're not involved in it when you need to clarify things. It's okay. So, the profile of a good listener is the opposite of this proverbial fool, in that a good listener is patient, energetic, and focused. Instead of being impatient, obviously they're patient. They're energetic. That means they're involved in the conversation and they're allowing their mind to be focused, not distracted. And I think it goes without saying he doesn't think so highly of himself that he regularly speaks before he hears. I think sometimes we think our advice is so good, we can't wait to share it. That's what we mean by active listening. It's not just passive. It's not just sitting there like a bobblehead. Incarnational listening. What in the world does that mean? Anyone want to take a stab at that? What do you think that might mean?
My first thought was almost like empathy. Like that's the first word that comes to my mind. Like listening, it's like putting myself in their place, like being able to like, yeah, really like place myself into what they're talking about.
Good. Yep. That's part of it. Yeah.
Me?
Oh, is that hand up or that was just...
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. First thoughts was just like face-to-face talk, communication. Because you could also do it through the phone or through any like FaceTime or anything. But it's different when you talk to a person face-to-face.
Yeah, that's a good observation. You know, anytime you're dealing with like serious conversation or serious issues, the closer the conversation you can have with the person, the better. So obviously, I think you're right, face-to-face or FaceTime, maybe then the phone. Texting is just bad.
Yeah.
Texting is bad. If you're in a serious conversation or you're trying to work something out with somebody, texting is not good.
You misspell something.
Or the spell correct changes a word on you. That happened to me one time.
Yeah, I think you have to keep it.
Yeah.
So that's a good observation. Although what we're talking about here is really entering their world. Like, what is the incarnation? Right? It's God becoming man and coming into our world. So we enter the world of the counselee through good listening. We're listening to understand. What are we understanding? Their world. So excellent listening is incarnational. It's how we enter and get to know the other person's world. Just like Jesus' earthly ministry began with the incarnation, so our ministry with a friend or a student begins with entering their world and getting to know it as they experience it. So we may not, my throat dries out after a while. We may not understand what it's like. We're talking about anxiety. We may not understand what it's like to have to deal with anxiety. And we've all dealt with it, but not to the degree that our friend or that the counselee is dealing with. So our goal is to understand what that's like. Now, it's interesting. Really what we're talking about here, the incarnational ministry of Christ is taught there by the author of Hebrews. And I didn't turn my thing off. It's a bad example. See that? The incarnational ministry, the author of Hebrews gives us a window into that. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. I think that's an awesome passage. Have you ever struggled with this idea, this concept? Does God really understand what I'm going through? Because after all, He's God. You ever struggle with that? You ever wrestle with that? Does God really understand? Maybe you haven't thought of that before. But the answer to that is yes, He does. And how do we know that? Because He became one of us. And He dealt with life the same way we have to. He was tempted in every respect the way we've been. The only difference is yet without sin. But He knows what it's like. He knows what it's like to be alone, to be betrayed, to hurt, to be rejected. He knows all those things. So He does understand. And that's what we mean by incarnational ministry. We enter a person's world to understand what it must be like, as best we can, to deal with what they're having to deal with. That doesn't mean we get to say, I understand. That's the hard part. We might begin to understand. We might begin to appreciate. But I'm not going to say that if I say it at all in the first session. And be careful, even with the illustrations you might use, like, yeah, I understand. I went through something like that too. Unless you get to know them better, because here's a dynamic that sometimes, not always, but sometimes takes place. They're trying to figure out if they can trust you with what you're doing. And if you're quick, again, to respond in a way that says, yeah, I understand. And then this is what we have to be careful of. You can sincerely understand, and yet you want to give advice based on your understanding of what you think it's like because you've kind of gone through something similar. Yeah, I understand. You know, when I went through that, I did da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And if we enter that too early, I think in the process, we're starting to shut them down. Because they're thinking, how can you at all? Because remember, what they're going through, they've been going through all their life maybe. Or a good season of their life. How could you possibly understand? We've only been talking for 45 minutes. Yep. And again, that's just, we don't think about that. Because we're excited, and in all sincerity, we're so excited that I think I do understand. I think I can help. Well, that's good. Just write that down in your notes. Because that may be a timing issue of when to bring that out. It might be good. That may come out, let's say, the first session. Oh, yeah, okay, I can connect with this person. I do understand. And maybe the second session, you begin the second session with a little story that goes something like this. You could say something like this. You know, I was thinking this week about you. Something popped into my head while we were talking last week, and I was thinking some more about this during the week. Make sure you are. And it reminded me of some stuff about 3 years ago that I was working through. It kind of connected me with your story a little bit. Do you mind me sharing it? There's a question, right? Do you mind me sharing it? I'm asking permission. I'm not just assuming. Most people are, yeah. And by the way, if you're thinking about them during the week like that, what is that communicating? Yeah. Now the person's ready to listen. See, that's and you've thought about it during the week because you might think about it during the week, yeah, that doesn't really apply. But that's a way of incarnational listening, entering the person's world. Think about Christ. Think about his conversations, how he engaged with people. You know, there's different scenarios. Peter in Matthew 16. You know, who do people say that I am? Oh man, that is such a powerful question. Who do you say that I am? That's why I entered the question, where do you see Christ in all of this? Some point in the counseling. In one conversation, and Jesus can do this because he knows the person's heart. But in one conversation, Jesus took it from praising Peter because of his answer to "Get thee behind me, Satan." It's an interesting passage there in Matthew 16. Then there's the Samaritan woman in John 4. That is a work of art. I'd like to break that passage down at some point, but have to be for another class. But the compassion that Christ showed and the skill of the questions. Again, I would encourage you just to take some time and read through John 4, the account of the Samaritan woman. He asked some very pointed questions. He was getting at some very pointed things. Nicodemus, another example, another great questions. And again, based on how well he knew the person too. So those are some examples. How skilled he was at drawing others out and communicating his sympathy for a person. Not just listening, but by loving them and showing them what ultimately should matter in their life, faith, hope, and love. Now you may say, well, how about the way Jesus talked to the Pharisees? Did anybody go there in your thinking? How come? Man, he was pretty rough with the Pharisees. What if somebody's acting pharisaical in the counseling room or in the counseling relationship? Well, you don't know a person's heart like Jesus did, so there's a big assumption. However, I will say this. People that are in higher levels of responsibility need to be spoken to more directly. For example, you give me an example. Think about that. That tells me that we're thinking, wow. People of higher levels of responsibility in various relationship contexts need to be spoken to more directly. What would be some of those kinds of relationships? Parent-child? If you have a conflict, if you're dealing with a family conflict, you know where you start? Even if the kids, the parents come to you and say, this is a true story, young man, the parents came into my office saying, can you meet with our son? He's just starting to rebel. He's starting to use marijuana. He's hanging out with the wrong people. Can you talk to him? Now, my heart, yeah, I'd be glad to, but I'd like to talk to you guys first. And interesting, I did talk to them, and they gave me their side. I talked to the son, and I found out a whole lot more of the whole family dynamic. And so I needed to start meeting not just with the son, but with the parents. Because the father was really kind of the anchor of the family, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, the son was making bad choices, but there was serious stuff going on with the father. And if there's going to be resolution to that, we have to go to the person who is most responsible. Same with the husband and wife relationship. God holds the husband more responsible than the wife. Sorry, guys. It's just true. When you get married, you're commanded to love your wife like Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. She just has to respect you. Now, I'm being a little facetious, but I'm also being very serious. That's what I mean here by, okay, if you're dealing with somebody that has a level of responsibility, some of what they need to know and understand in your conversation and as you're listening is, how does their situation impact other lives? If you don't get things together here, this isn't just impacting you, this is impacting your family, your marriage, your relationship to your kids. That's what we're talking about here. And Jesus is a great example of that. And that's why he was very direct with Peter. Peter, that's the devil talking. All right, do you mind a little funny digress here? Just popped into my head. Y'all know who Tony Evans is? Pastor in Dallas. Great pastor, great speaker. He's spoken up here a number of times. Talk about distractions, right? We're talking about distractions and cell phones. He tells a story. I can only imagine this because he's a very vivacious personality. From the pulpit, he's preaching in his church, and somebody's cell phone goes off. It was right in one of those quiet moments, in between points. People are supposed to be kind of pondering what was just said, and all of a sudden the phone goes off. Pastor Evans all of a sudden looks at him and says, "Don't you answer that. That's the devil calling you." Can you imagine? Can you imagine getting that from the pulpit? I think I would imagine no phones went off from that point on. All right, so what is communication? What is communication? This is important for us to understand. And I love this definition. This is one of my mentors, one of my profs I had in graduate school, Dr. Wayne Mack, one of the men that really is kind of the foundational people in developing the idea of biblical counseling. But in his book, Your Family, God's Way, which is basically a book about family communication, excellent resource to have, by the way, but he defines communication this way, and you'll hear a lot of some of the things I've already been talking about, because obviously a lot of that is his influence. The process of sharing information with another person in such a way that the sender's message and the receiver have come to a common meaning. They haven't communicated. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. My glasses here. Unless the sender and the receiver have come to a common meaning, they haven't communicated effectively. There's that idea of understanding and common meaning. Have you ever talked on a cell phone with a bad connection somehow, where the data's breaking up and you're only getting parts of sentences? So a person's talking about something and you're only getting part of the sentence. What do we do when we only hear part of the sentence and it's broken up? In our mind, what do we sometimes do? We try to fill it in, right? Right. That, by the way, is not good communication. But we do that all the time. And that's why he focuses on the aspect of common meaning. the sender and the receiver. In other words, what we're talking about here, good communication is listening to understand. I've said that before. Not just to dump information. Because you're gonna think, okay, let's say you're in the stage of giving instruction. You're actually sharing God's word with somebody, and it's really good. You really like it. And it is. It's a good passage. And you've done your best to get it to them. And yet, how do you know they understood? I'll give you an example, and this is a cross-cultural thing. I mentioned a little bit about this in the first session, but again, I was counseling a good brother from Korea, and there was a language issue greater than I thought. I mean, I admire our international students who are trying to learn English while learning God's word all at the same time, and learn another culture. I just admire that. And so we're talking, and he's having a problem with somebody else in his room. And he's very polite. And I'm talking and I'm sharing things. And I kept asking the question because I was concerned that I was communicating and that he was understanding, because 2 languages, 2 cultures. And I'd say, do you understand? Does this, and I say this a lot, does this make sense? Yes. Yes. Very polite. So I think, okay, we're making progress. Oh man, I wasn't even close. And again, because the Korean culture is one of respect of people who are older than you, he couldn't say he didn't understand, because that would be disrespectful. Now to us, maybe in our American way, we think, oh, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, it does make sense. We haven't grown up in that. And because the reason I finally discovered that is because I just asked one time, well, I first asked, do you understand? He said, yes. Well, can you tell me what I just said to you? I'm sorry, Mr. Joe, I can't. Oh, okay. So now it's okay. Have you been understanding what I've been saying? I'm sorry, Mr. Joe, no. So we had to go back from square one and start over again. I had to change my whole approach. So again, that's the idea. Now that's an unusual kind of thing. Maybe you'll have the joy and the privilege of sharing with other cultures and whatnot. However, even within our own culture, another aspect of this is just because you said it doesn't mean they understand it. And no matter how good, how accurate, how biblical, how well said your presentation was, doesn't mean they understood it. And the other thing is, good communication isn't just dumping a bunch of knowledge or dumping a bunch of data. In fact, in a counseling situation, especially in a relational one, sometimes couples think that they've communicated when they just told the other person. Okay, now that I gave you this information, you're responsible for it. That's not communication. Giving somebody information or dumping data on them doesn't mean you communicated. Well, I told him. Well, I told you, honey, I did this and I did that. Well, that's just data dump. And data dump is not communication. Okay. I know we're getting into this a little deep, but I'm just trying to help you kind of process, because as we're talking to counselees, that's really important for us. Most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Now, we just have to look into our own hearts. And again, it's just a discipline to be a good listener. It's interesting that the father in Proverbs spends a lot of time counseling his son on how to be a good listener. I think that's instructional for us. Skillful living is about skillful listening. All right, so what would that look like? What do these skills look like? Demonstrate a sincere interest. Demonstrate a sincere interest. In other words, there's got to be a higher motivation. Because how many of you would say that you're more on the extroverted side? That that maybe you would be more maybe about kind of jumping and answering too quickly. If that's where your fault was going to be, okay. How many of you say that you're more introverted? A little more shy, maybe a little hesitant on what to share. Okay. Now here's the thing. Sincere listening means this. My concern is going to be focused on the counselee, the friend, whoever it is I'm talking to, not me. If I'm an introvert, I'm going to be motivated by a genuine love for that other person. So I'm going to be willing to embarrass myself, make a mistake. If that happens, I'm okay with that. If I'm willing to love a person and come out of myself and learn how not to fear. On the other hand, if I tend to be more outgoing and maybe a little bit more, impulsive in speaking up sooner than I should, again, I'm going to concentrate on loving that other person, and I'm just going to learn the skill of listening and learn the skill of quickly listening. You see, in order to overcome our personality weaknesses, we need to be motivated by a higher desire, which is to love that other person. Why am I going to have this conversation right now? Because I love them. That's what we mean by sincere interest. Show respect through nonverbals. Show respect through nonverbals. I mean, you guys talking about that before. Eye contact is important. I find it very hard, by the way, to teach online. When we were in shutdown last year, I was glad to do that, but it was hard. It's kind of talking like this, and all the classes were recorded. So it's like, there's nobody out there. And I tried to get my grandkids, to sit down and kind of be my audience, but they wouldn't, they wouldn't have it. So the nonverbals you can't see, and this interaction is so important for teaching and for counseling. Now it's great that we can Zoom counsel, and I did a lot of that, and at least you can see the person. But you communicate negatively or positively. Somebody shares something to you and you go, yeah, right, like, uh-oh, what did I say? Something wrong? Just in a moment. Now, that kind of brought a tickle to you, but imagine what that's like if you're pouring out your heart, or it's the deer, in front of headlight kind of look. Like, the stuff you're hearing is so shocking. It's like, just be aware of that. Yes. Yes, so it is a requirement now. We are going to. And behind the math, it's like. Or Zoom, you just step out of the camera and go. But body language is important in that regard. my kids, when my kids were kids, they're all adults now, they had a saying, "Dad, you have the face." Because it was a face of consternation. I have a poker face. Can I say that? Yeah. You know, I don't hide my emotions. You know, man of 1,000 faces. So, but people interpret that. And I would come home sometimes and I would be solving a problem from work, right? So I'm sitting in the chair. The kids would say something and say, "What?" It was like, ooh. So it was, Dad had the face. That's what it came to be. That's body language. Listen to encourage, not just to correct.
Oh, I like that.
Listen to encourage, not just correct. We don't have to fix everything right away. And by the way, for some situations, you're going to have to build a relationship anyway. You know, if you say you're at your church, you're counseling, you're a youth leader, youth minister, you're a counselor at a church, you're in a counseling ministry, and a judge, and this happens, I know out in Lafayette, they have a great relationship with the court system there. A lot of times, young people are sent to the church for counseling. And guess what? A lot of times, those kids don't want to be there. But you have a great opportunity to really build a relationship. Especially you, more so than me. It takes some time. So listen to encourage, not just correct. And then another important thing here for us to consider is what we're listening for. What we're listening for. Now this gives us, some goals. We're not just listening, but what are we listening for? Okay, we're listening for a host of things. Now we just qualified, we want to listen to encourage, not just to correct. Okay. Listen for, maybe they have all kinds of things going on in their heart, in their life, but some of the things we want to listen for and make note of that may come up. Now again, we're not going to deal with it all right away, but this is some of the things I write down. Maybe they have some wrong goals. Remember, the one guy, help me get my wife back. That's it's not totally a wrong goal, but it's a short-sighted goal. So I want to get us going on the right goal. Blame shifting. Exaggerations. Background events. Sometimes there's a victim mentality. Now, some of these are negative, I get it. But here's the thing, even people who are suffering, even when you and I suffer, and it's no fault of our own, we're still sinners. And we actually complicate our suffering by how we process it. Now, I'm not going to jump all over them. I just want to understand how they're processing that, because that's going to help me help them. And it's easy to fall into something like this. And if we're stuck in a victim mentality, it's hard. I mean, I've been there. Woe is me. Look at all these bad things people are doing to me. And it impacts your life. What do they believe about God, about their circumstances? This will never end. This will never end. I'm never going to get over this. That's a belief. Which is tied to attitudes. Attitudes and beliefs are hard to separate. What are the demands? Angry father. My children will respect me. That's a demand. And by the way, it's children should respect, but became a demand. Expectations. What's not said? Why don't they talk about this? This would seem to fit here. Hopelessness. Repeated words and phrases. Superstitions and mysticism. What do you think that means?
Every time I wear this sweater, I have a bad day.
There you go. There you go. Oh, and believe it or not, I know believers have those. Do they accept responsibility or not? Defensiveness, evasiveness. I can't, or this is too much. Motive judging, magical thinking. What's magical thinking?
Like wishful thinking, like something that may be out of their reach per se. Like, say, I guess so like the guy who had one of his wife back, that's almost like wishful thinking because he technically is in control of that, and neither are you. You'd have to go to the Lord and adhere to the biblical counseling.
All right. I'll give you another example of magical thinking. I've been doing my quiet time. How come this happened? Is that relabeling sin, calling it something else. Self-talk. What are the things that they say to themselves a lot? And that might be tied into beliefs and attitudes. And then overall, just what are themes in their life that you're hearing? What are themes? As you're hearing all of what they're saying, what are some of the themes that you keep hearing over and over again? Again, I gave an example, the anxieties and the stressors maybe in their life. Know how to listen. And then clarify unclear points. If you're not sure, ask more questions. Or, number 7, summarize the information. So what you're saying, if I understand this right, what you're saying is, and then just summarize that. And that's something good to do, especially when they've said a lot. And before moving on to the next question, I'm not sure if I understand this. Let me see if I understand this correctly. Or I like to say, please help me to understand this. Listen like you're taking a prayer request. Listen like you're taking a prayer request. Because in a sense you are. If you had to repeat what you just heard before the throne of grace, interceding for them before the throne of grace, what would you say? What would you tell the Lord? What would your prayer request be? Because, by the way, you're going to be doing that anyway, perhaps at the end of the counseling session. And there's nothing like having listened through the whole counseling session, and when you pray, they know you've been listening. Because they hear in your prayer. And when you say you're going to be praying for them this week between sessions, and they just heard what you prayed, that gives tremendous encouragement. In fact, prayer joins together our knowledge of others, our love for them, and our knowledge of God and His promises. We're bringing all of that together. All of the things that they said, the fact that we love them because we've listened to them, and we're connecting that to our knowledge of God and His promises. That's what makes an excellent counselor. All right. And we end just on time. Hope you all have a good weekend.